The first snow of December fell softly outside, coating the Vermont town in quiet white. Inside the small but warm kitchen, Emma stirred a pot of soup, listening to the slow ticking of the clock. The sound had become too familiar, steady, predictable, and painfully ordinary. It had been like this for months now. The children were grown, their voices gone from the hallways. The only sounds that filled the house were the hum of the heater and the faint creak of old wood. When the front door opened, I teed. When the front door opened, he brushed off snow from his coat and smiled faintly when their eyes met. 24 years of marriage had taught her how to read that smile. It was kind, but tired. He sat at the table, loosening his scarf. "Smells good," he said, glancing toward the stove. "Apple pie," Emma replied, returning his smile. "You used to ask for it every Friday." He chuckled softly. "I still do. You just stopped asking what I wanted." His voice was gentle, but it carried a weight that made her pause. She didn't respond right away. They had been drifting, and both knew it. It wasn't about love. The love was still there, steady as ever. It was about life. About how everything felt slower, smaller, quieter. Dinner passed mostly in silence. Afterward, as Emma wiped down the counter, Daniel spoke again, his tone uncertain. "Em, can I ask you something?" She turned, noticing how he was staring at his hands instead of her face. "Of course." He hesitated. "I've been thinking about something lately. Something I've wanted for a long time." Her heart skipped a beat. His tone was calm, but there was something behind it, something that made her uneasy. "What kind of something?" He took a slow breath. "A wish, I guess. Something I've never said out loud." Emma leaned against the counter, trying to smile. "You make it sound serious." "'Tis," he said quietly. Then, after a pause, "I want us to live differently. To leave this house for a while. Maybe sell it. Maybe travel. Just start fresh somewhere." The words hit her like a wave. "You want to leave everything?" she asked, almost whispering. "Not everything," he replied quickly. "Just the routine, the walls, the weight of it all. We've built a good life, Em, but maybe it's time to live it before it's too late." Before it's too late. That phrase echoed in her mind. She stared at him, seeing both the man she knew and a stranger she didn't recognize. "You're not unhappy, are you?" He smiled sadly. "Not unhappy, just restless." "Don't you ever feel that way?" She wanted to say no, but she couldn't. There were days she'd stand by the window, watching people walk by, wondering where they were headed and what it felt like to still have dreams to chase. There were nights she'd lie awake, missing the version of herself who used to believe in surprises. Now Daniel was offering her one. Still, the thought of leaving the home where they'd raised their children, where every wall carried a story, made her chest tighten. "This house is part of us," she said. "I know," he replied. "But maybe it's time to find a new part of us." He looked at her with the same eyes that once convinced her to say yes to everything: marriage, children, moving states, all of it. Those eyes still held warmth, but there was a flicker of fear in them, too. She didn't know what it was yet, but she could feel it. That night, after he'd gone to bed, Emma stayed up sitting by the fire. The house was quiet, only the soft hiss of logs burning. She thought about the way he'd said it: before it's too late. Daniel was only 56, still strong and healthy. But something about his words felt like he was running from time itself. Was there something he wasn't telling her? She tried to brush it away. Maybe it was just midlife restlessness, the kind that came when people realized how fast time moved. But deep down, she sensed this wish wasn't born from boredom. It came from somewhere deeper. The next morning, Daniel was up early. He was in the garage sorting through old boxes, things they hadn't touched in years. "What are you doing?" she asked, wrapping her robe tighter around herself. He smiled, wiping dust off his hands. "Just clearing out space. Maybe this is the start." Emma frowned. "You really mean it, don't you?" "I do," he said, his voice firm but calm. "We've given everything to this house. The kids are gone. We're both healthy. Maybe it's time to give something to ourselves." She watched him for a moment. He looked different, almost lighter. There was energy in the way he moved, purpose in his tone. And though she wanted to resist, a small spark of excitement flickered inside her. That day, she found herself opening old drawers, sorting photos, and dusting shelves she hadn't touched in months. The idea of change frightened her, but it also woke her up. She found an old picture of them young, smiling, standing in front of their first apartment in Boston. She stared at it for a long time, remembering how fearless they used to be. That night at dinner, she finally said, "If you really want to do this, then yes, let's try." Daniel looked at her with surprise and relief. "Are you sure?" She nodded slowly. "I don't know what it means yet, but I'm saying yes." He reached across the table, taking her hand gently. "That means everything, Em." They talked for hours that night, about places they could visit, things they'd always postponed. Daniel wanted to drive across the country, to see the ocean again, to sleep in cabins and small inns. Emma found herself laughing, feeling a sense of youth she hadn't felt in years. But even as they dreamed aloud, she noticed small things, moments that didn't feel right. The way Daniel rubbed his chest when he thought she wasn't looking. The way he'd pause mid-sentence as if catching his breath. The way he sometimes looked out the window, lost in thought, as if time was slipping through his fingers. When she asked if something was wrong, he brushed it off with a smile. "Just tired," he said. That night, after he fell asleep, Emma sat on the edge of the bed, watching him breathe. She thought about all the years they'd spent together, raising children, working, surviving the ups and downs. She realized she had been so focused on keeping things safe and steady that she had forgotten what it meant to live boldly. Maybe that was what Daniel wanted, not to escape, but to remind them both that they still had a life worth chasing. Still, there was something unspoken in his wish, something that made her chest tighten every time he smiled too softly. The next morning, Daniel walked into the kitchen holding a map. "I found our first stop," he said with a grin. "A small lake town in Maine. Remember the one we visited years ago?" Emma smiled faintly. "Of course I remember." He placed the map on the table, eyes gleaming with excitement. "Then it's decided. We start there." As she looked at the map, tracing her fingers over the small blue lake, she felt a rush of emotions: fear, hope, love, uncertainty, all tangled together. Maybe this was what new beginnings felt like. Terrifying, but full of possibility. She met his gaze and smiled. "Okay," she said softly. "Let's do it." Daniel exhaled, almost in relief, and pulled her close. For the first time in a long time, Emma felt his heart beat against hers, and it was steady, strong, alive. But as he held her, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was holding her a little tighter than usual, as if he was afraid to let go. And in that moment, Emma didn't realize that Daniel's wish wasn't just about living differently. It was about making sure she'd remember how to live when he couldn't anymore. The morning they left Vermont, the air was cold and sharp, the kind that made every breath feel alive. Emma stood on the front porch, her hands wrapped around a travel mug of coffee, staring at the house they had called home for 24 years. The shutters, the old mailbox, the rose bush Daniel planted the year their daughter was born, it all looked smaller now. Daniel came up behind her, suitcase in hand, and touched her shoulder. "You ready?" he asked softly. She nodded, though part of her wasn't. Leaving was harder than she thought it would be. But when she looked at Daniel's face, she saw something she hadn't seen in years, a spark. That made her brave enough to say yes. They packed the car and began their journey. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, and the snow slowly gave way to open fields and winter-bare trees. Daniel hummed along to old songs on the radio, his hand resting on the steering wheel. Emma watched him, realizing how different he seemed, calmer, lighter. Every now and then, he'd reach for her hand, squeeze it gently, smile without a word. Their first stop was the lake town in Maine Daniel had mentioned. It was exactly as they remembered it: quiet streets, cozy inns, and a frozen lake that looked like a silver mirror under the winter sun. They checked into a small cabin overlooking the water. The owner, an older woman with kind eyes, told them, "You two picked the best time. It's peaceful this season." That night they sat by the fireplace, wrapped in blankets. The crackle of burning wood filled the silence. Emma stared into the flames, thinking about how far they had come, not just in miles, but in spirit. "I still can't believe we actually did it," she said softly. Daniel smiled. "I told you it was time for a change." She turned to him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You know, you still haven't told me why this mattered so much to you." He hesitated, staring at the fire. "Because I don't want us to spend the rest of our lives waiting," he said. "Waiting for the right time, the right season, the right reason. We've done that too long." There was something final in the way he said it, like a man who had already decided that time wasn't endless. Emma leaned against him, feeling warmth and unease at the same time. The next few days were filled with quiet beauty. They walked around the frozen lake, visited small cafes, and talked about everything they hadn't talked about in years. Emma noticed how Daniel looked at things as if memorizing them. Every sunset, every laugh, every moment. He'd stop and take deep breaths, as though the air itself mattered. One evening, they sat on a bench overlooking the lake, wrapped in scarves. Daniel looked out at the horizon and said, "Do you remember when we came here with the kids?" "Of course," Emma said. "They built that little snow fort near the dock." He smiled faintly. "That was a good day. I think about it sometimes. How fast it all went." Emma reached for his hand. "We were busy living, Dan. That's what happens." He nodded, then looked down at their hands. His thumb brushed against hers. "I just want to make sure we don't forget how to live." Something in his tone made her chest tighten. She wanted to ask what he meant, but she didn't. Instead, she leaned against his shoulder, letting the silence say what words couldn't. A few days later, as they packed up to leave, Emma noticed a bottle of pills in Daniel's bag. They weren't familiar. Her heart thumped as she read the label's something for his heart. Prescription strength. Her hands trembled slightly. She hadn't seen these before. When he came back into the room, she quickly slipped the bottle back into the bag. He smiled at her, unaware. "Ready for the next stop?" Emma forced a smile. "Yes, of course." They drove south, through quiet towns and open highways. Daniel seemed as cheerful as ever, singing along to old Bruce Springsteen songs and pointing out roadside diners. But Emma couldn't stop thinking about the pills. She watched him more closely, the way he'd pause before standing up. The times he rubbed his chest and looked away quickly, pretending she hadn't noticed. That night, at a small inn in Connecticut, she couldn't hold it in anymore. As they were getting ready for bed, she asked softly, "Dan, why didn't you tell me?" He froze for a moment, then sighed. "You looked in my bag," her eyes filled with tears. "You should have told me, Daniel." He sat down on the edge of the bed. "It's not as bad as it looks." "Then tell me how bad it is," she said, her voice shaking. He took a long breath. "A few months ago, I had some chest pain. The doctor ran tests. Said I've got some heart issues. Nothing too serious yet, but—" He trailed off, his eyes fixed on the floor. "It made me think. About time. About us. About how fragile everything is." Emma felt her throat tighten. "You were scared." He nodded. I didn't want you to see me as weak. I just wanted to do something beautiful before life started making decisions for us." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "So this trip, this wish, it was because you were afraid of losing time." He looked up at her then, his eyes filled with emotion. "No, because I didn't want to lose us." She sat beside him, resting her head against his shoulder. "You could have told me." "I didn't want your pity," he whispered. "I just wanted your yes." Emma wrapped her arms around him. And for the first time in months, they both cried, not out of sadness, but from the weight of everything they hadn't said. That next morning, the world looked softer somehow. They continued their journey, but something had shifted between them. They spoke more openly, laughed louder, and cherished the smallest things: morning coffee, roadside picnics. Holding hands while walking through quiet streets. In Rhode Island, they stayed near the coast. The ocean stretched endlessly, gray and wild. Daniel stood by the water for a long time, the wind pushing through his hair. Emma joined him, slipping her hand into his. "You were right. she said quietly. We needed this. He smiled. We did. That night, they sat by the window, watching the moonlight ripple across the water. Daniel reached into his pocket and handed her a small folded note. I wrote this before we left, he said. She unfolded it, her eyes scanning the short message written in his neat handwriting. If you're reading this, it means I did it. I made you say yes. Whatever happens next, just remember, we still have time as long as we keep choosing to live. Emma looked up, her eyes wet. Daniel. He shook his head gently. Don't cry. Just promise me you'll keep saying yes to life, to change, to whatever comes next. She nodded, unable to speak. The next morning, Daniel seemed quieter. He smiled often, but there was a softness to him, as if he was already letting go of something inside. As they drove toward their final stop, a seaside cottage they had rented, Emma found herself memorizing everything about him. His laugh, his profile against the sunlight, the way his hand felt when he reached for hers. That evening, the sky turned pink over the ocean. They sat on the porch together, wrapped in a blanket, sipping tea. Daniel looked peaceful, the sound of waves filling the silence. He turned to her and whispered, Thank you for saying yes. Emma smiled, pressing her head against his shoulder. Always. She didn't know that the words would echo in her memory forever that night. That moment would become the one she'd hold on to when everything changed. For now, she only knew that they had found something rare again. Not just love, but purpose. Not just comfort, but courage. And though she didn't know what tomorrow would bring, Emma finally understood what Daniel's wish had truly been. Not to escape life, but to remind them both how to live it fully, together, before it slipped away. The morning after their last night by the sea began quietly. The sun rose slow and golden, spreading light across the waves outside their cottage. Emma woke up to the sound of gulls calling and the soft rhythm of the tide. Daniel was sitting outside already, wrapped in a blanket, a cup of coffee steaming in his hands. He looked peaceful, almost too peaceful. She stepped outside, the wooden floor cool beneath her feet. You're up early, she said softly. He turned his head and smiled. Didn't want to miss the sunrise. Emma sat beside him, pulling her own blanket over her shoulders. It's beautiful, she whispered. Daniel nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. You know, I used to think I'd seen enough of life, that there wasn't much left to discover. But I was wrong. She smiled faintly. You always are. He laughed, the sound soft and warm. For a while, they just sat there watching the sky turn from pink to gold. Then, out of nowhere, he reached for her hand and squeezed it gently. If something ever happens to me, promise me one thing. Her heart tightened. Don't say that. Promise, he insisted, his voice steady. She took a shaky breath. What is it? Promise me you'll keep living, he said. Go places. Meet people. Laugh. Say yes to everything that scares you. Don't stop because I'm not there. Emma looked at him, her eyes stinging. Daniel, please. He smiled softly. Just promise. She nodded, fighting the lump in her throat. I promise. He leaned in and kissed her forehead. Good, that's all I need. That day, they took a walk along the shore, hand in hand, the cold wind brushing their faces. Daniel looked stronger than he had in days, laughing and pointing out seashells, teasing her when she tried to collect them like a child. But later that afternoon, as the sky turned gray, he grew quiet. They returned to the cottage, and he sat on the couch, rubbing his chest lightly. Emma noticed and placed a hand on his arm. You okay? He nodded. Just tired. I'll rest a bit. She covered him with a blanket and watched him close his eyes. For the next hour, she sat beside him, reading, listening to the waves outside. The sound was calm, almost hypnotic. When she turned to check on him again, she saw his face, still, peaceful, too still. Her heart dropped. Daniel? She whispered, shaking his arm gently. Dan? He didn't move. Her hands trembled as she called his name again. Case. Louder this time, tears welling before she even realized what was happening. Daniel, please wake up, please. But deep down she knew. His hand was still warm, his expression calm, but he was gone. Emma broke down, her sobs echoing through the small cottage. The world outside kept moving, the waves, the wind, the seagulls, but for her, time stopped completely. She held his hand, whispering, "You kept your promise. You made me say yes." "You did." Hours passed before she could move. She called for help, and when the paramedics arrived, everything felt unreal, like watching someone else's life. They spoke softly, treated her gently, but their eyes told her what she already knew. Daniel's heart had simply stopped. In the days that followed, Emma stayed in Maine. She couldn't bear to go back home yet. The cottage became her quiet world, a place filled with his laughter, his warmth, and the sound of the sea he loved so much. Every morning she'd sit in his chair, sipping coffee, staring at the ocean, just as he did. It hurt, but it also healed her a little each day. When she finally returned to Vermont, the house felt like a memory she was walking through. Every photo, every sound, every empty chair reminded her of him. But she also felt something new, a sense of peace. Daniel hadn't left her with emptiness. He'd left her with purpose. A few weeks later, she found his journal inside his drawer. She hadn't known he kept one. The pages were filled with sketches, travel plans, and notes written in his familiar handwriting. On the last page, he had written, "If she says yes, it means she still believes in us. And if I'm not there, it means she still has time to live for both of us." Emma cried when she read it, but they were different tears this time. They weren't just for loss, they were for love, for gratitude, for the life they had shared. Months passed, and Emma began to do what she promised. She started small, taking short trips, joining local art classes, meeting new people. At first, it felt wrong to enjoy things without him. But soon she realized that in every sunrise, every new face, and every road she took, Daniel was there in spirit. One morning, she drove back to the same lake town in Maine where their journey had begun. The snow was falling again, soft and quiet, just like the first night he had told her about his wish. She sat by the same frozen lake, holding a small wooden box, the one that carried his ashes. She opened it gently, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "You've got your wish, Dan," she whispered. "And I kept my promise." Scattered the ashes into the wind, watching as they drifted out over the lake. Carried away like whispers of memory. For a long time, she just stood there, tears rolling down her cheeks, but her heart strangely light. The pain was still there, but so was peace. He hadn't left her with emptiness. He had given her a path. On her drive home, she played his favorite song on the radio. The lyrics made her smile, and for the first time, she sang along, loud and fearless. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was living. That spring, Emma sold the house in Vermont. Her children worried at first, but she assured them she was fine. She bought a small cottage near the sea, just like the one she and Daniel had stayed in. She started painting, something she hadn't done in decades. Her canvases filled with skies, waves, and sunlight, the things Daniel loved. One afternoon, as she painted by the window, she saw a young couple walking by the beach, holding hands and laughing. For a second, she saw herself and Daniel in them, the same warmth, the same innocence. She smiled softly. Life moved on, but love remained. Every night, Emma sat outside her cottage, watching the sunset. She kept 2 chairs on the porch, though she only needed one. Sometimes she spoke out loud, pretending Daniel was still beside her. "You were right," she'd say. "We didn't need a big house or a perfect plan. We just needed to say yes." And every time the wind brushed against her face, she imagined it was him reminding her gently that love never ends. It just changes shape. Years later, when her daughter visited, she found Emma's journal filled with travel notes and sketches. On the last page, Emma had written something familiar.